Hey, it's Alex Williams, the News Stack here with Jim Zemlin. Jim, how are you?
Great. Good morning. Nice to be here.
And I never get the titles right. Executive Director?
Yes, Executive Director.
That's what I thought.
Sam Ramsey of the Cloud Foundry Foundation likes to go by CEO.
Yes.
I prefer the more unassuming Executive Director
Executive
title.
Director. Yeah, I always thought CEO. Okay. There's a question that's starting to come up a lot lately about the economics of open source, and This is really an interesting question. I think it's going to be one of these questions. I think it's really going to define how we perceive open source and really what its actual value is, because I don't think it's actually been realized. And now, what we see without a doubt is just because I have here's my phone's right on this table, right? You have your laptop sitting right there. Software is the center of our lives.
Right.
It's the center of every organization.
Right.
And open source really is at the heart of software development.
Yeah. And
so if open source is at the heart of software development, that means that the way the open source communities function it will change. I mean, it has. We've got to come a long way with open source communities and how they've progressed.
Yeah.
But now we're seeing much more involvement by a lot of different kinds of companies, and we're seeing really through what we see at the Linux Foundation, the emergence of foundations. And with the emergence of foundations and these member companies, you see a lot of different economic dynamics come into that, right? Because they're selling software, right? They have users, they have a community. There's this open source movement around that you're seeing with developers really becoming a force. So I'm trying to make sense of that.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to make sense of. What are the changing dynamics of the economics of open source? That you see reflecting in your work and what the foundation is doing overall.
Yeah, it's a interesting topic, and it's to some degree there's always been large corporate involvement in open source software,
right,
dating back to the investment that IBM made in Linux, $1 billion investment back when $1 billion meant something.
Yes, can you believe that? That's what we're saying, when it meant something.
Exactly, and when Oracle ported their database to Linux. I mean, that was a huge breakthrough for open source and Linux, I would argue, and really did make possible the whole ecosystem around the Linux community transform from what was, for more than a decade, with Linus and a group of developers having a largely volunteer-led community, to again in the late 90s and early 2000s becoming really a professionalized group of developers. Most people who work on the kernel are pros. So just to predicate the conversation, I think there's always been large scale corporate involvement in open source. It's one of the things that makes it work. If you think of organizations taking open source software, creating products and services based on that, taking the improvements that they've made, contributing them back to that project as they release their product, and then moving on to a next generation, because they don't want to manage the development process by themselves, and then doing another project, making improvements. It's sort of this virtuous cycle. I think that's always been, and has for a long time been, a part of open source. But your bigger question is now, as software has become a more important part of our lives,
right,
and open source has become a more important part of software, really having a much larger footprint in any technology product or service. More than half of the code in most technologies these days is open source. What's the economic forces driving that? Why do we see more open source projects being supported by nonprofit organizations, like the Linux Foundation? I think those are interesting questions. I think at a high level, it's a confluence of forces beyond open source that are driving the issue. One, I think, that is particularly interesting after sort of the idea that software has become a more important part of everyday lives. There's more expectations of consumers for any consumer device is software driven, as more hardware and, for example, networking is being abstracted into software. Beyond that, I think you're seeing a shift in the tech sector from a product industry to more of a services industry, right? Kind of across the board, if you think about it. And this started off as, software as a service and, hosted applications. Salesforce is sort of a quintessential example of that. Prior to that, we had application service providers and, different kind of hosted software offerings. The emergence of cloud providers like Amazon Web Services and so forth, I think is, a furtherance of this move from a product industry to a software industry. There was a report, I think it was last year, that cited for every dollar spent on Amazon Web Services, $4 of traditional IT spend simply disappears. Right? And so as you shift towards a more service-centric industry where, Facebook and Salesforce.com and hosted applications in the cloud become an important part of the way technology is delivered and the way people interact with technology, open source is a perfect adjunct to that, because what you're, when software is a product, it's on the profit side of the ledger, right? When software is a part of a bill of materials to deliver a subscription-based service, it's actually moved over to the cost side, right, of the ledger. And so the idea of having lower cost software that you can modify to, be able to scale your service more effectively by having access to that source code, being able to shed this commodity R&D into a project where you can collaborate even with your, competitors, is very, very attractive to any kind of, service-based company, because who wants to reinvent their own Linux kernel, right? Like, who needs to, the database itself doesn't distinguish Netflix or Facebook. It's their users and the data itself, right? Not the fact that they're using, MySQL or some database. So you're shedding commodity R&D, sharing that development with your competitors, and that's part of, I think, the thing that's making that trend happen more quickly is this move towards a services model in tech in general. The rise of sort of structured organizations to help manage that, I believe, comes from the fact that as you're looking to essentially shed commodity R&D, share development with competitors, you need to do that in a trusted manner. You need to be able to pool assets somewhere that are used to run the infrastructure, to do the development activity around that, and you need a place to hold trademarks, which are often used to enforce, let's say, some kind of compliance standard. You need a place to manage, intellectual property matters like copyright or patent issues and so forth. And by structuring those under nonprofit organizations, it gives companies confidence that, no single company can, get an edge over another player in that entity, because, a nonprofit can't transfer their assets to a for-profit, right? So you're not going to be able to run off with this thing over time. And that's just provided a stable set of resources for all these companies to be able to collaborate effectively. And that's I think, why we're seeing the rise of these organizations. Now, if you talk about the economic value of open source, I think you can think of it in sort of concentric circles out from the actual source code itself, which, we've looked at various methods to analyze what the value of open source is based on the lines of source code produced, right? And we've used methods like the unfortunately named Kokomo method, which is I think there's another Slocum method. Is another, unfortunately, methodology for measuring this. But I think there is a tangible value to what it would take to reproduce the, hundreds of thousands of lines of code in the Linux kernel, for example. I mean, it's in the billions. I mean, it's a very expensive code base to reproduce. Beyond that, you have then and I think Ping Li from Excel Ventures, which is Excel is a firm that I think really groks open source and the economics around it from their experience backing companies like Cloudera and others. You have sort of what it would cost to build an ecosystem of users, of application developers building on top of a particular platform, for a single company versus, an open source community and by proxy then a large group of companies and individuals doing that together. And that value is more difficult to measure. But if you look at what the value of the ecosystem around the Win API was at some point relative to Microsoft's value, I mean, there's tremendous value to build a developer ecosystem around these things, right? And then you continue to go out, like, what's the value of then being able to offer a service on top of that? And you start to get these sort of concentric circles out from value. So you sort of start with what's the raw source code, and so on and so forth. And then you could start, as you deconstruct that, look at methods everywhere in between to say, okay, one of the other attributes of open source is that the developers who do a lot of the core development work, for example, of Node.js or of the Linux kernel, these are maybe the top 3% of developers in the globe. Like, if you're Linus Torvalds or Greg Hartman or James Bottomley, or you're one of the lead maintainers of Node.js, these are very rare and extremely talented developers who have sort of made their way up through demonstrating their technical skill to the highest level of being the actual person who decides what goes into a critical open source project or not. And you would argue that their code and the code produced through that method could be disproportionately valuable to code where product manager in a company's got a group of people who they've kind of hired, and they've tried to hire the best people, and they just got to ship the product, and it creates an additional economic value related to just the quality of the software coming out of that and so forth. So this is, I think, something that academia is interested in. I know that at Harvard Business School they're looking into the economics of open source and how to measure the value across these different metrics. We've been approached by other academic institutions to look into this. We've obviously done work here. But it's clear that this trend is going to continue, will increase. We're not seeing at the Linux Foundation a deceleration of, how many different open source projects want to come together and have a structured organization around them. People sometimes tell me, well, we've got too many of these foundations. And my answer is, before we had too much proprietary software, and now we have too many open source organizations. And then more specifically, what is the number that's correct? 31? Just Baskin Robbins.
Right.
40? We're always 40, right? But
right.
I think
they're doing flavors of
I think the trend I think the trend goes as the software industry grows, and that there just continues to be more requirements for. I mean, we saw yesterday the Clinton Foundation and the Moja Global Project is trying to build a platform to tackle the idea of monitoring global emissions across the 185, I can't remember the exact number, 180 companies who are signatories to the Paris Accords.
Right.
And that's a big data problem. That's a political issue. I mean, we're seeing more, not less, of these collective projects to create open source projects.
As more members join these foundations, and there's more participation in the foundations, it does become a factor of market economics in some respect, because each one of these member companies has their own interests, right?
Sure.
How does that play out into the operations of the foundations themselves? Because this is when you can start seeing, I mentioned this yesterday, someone mentioned to me, this is where game theory starts to become almost a factor kind of in all the dynamics, of how companies interact inside these foundations, and how policies are set, and how decisions are made.
Yeah. I mean, my immediate response to that is the game is much less interesting than one might think it is. In that you're correct in that each of the organizations, and I would argue the individual developers as well, who participate in any open source project, are doing it out of some form of interest. For developers, that tends to be, I want to work on an interesting problem with a peer group and create innovative software, and the act of that creation is fun, because ultimately development is an artistic act, right? It's a creative act, and that's something that's fun, and that's something that people come in, and that's their interest, and that's why they're doing it. business comes into these efforts because they have some commercial interest. They want to, shed a commodity component of their software infrastructure, share in development with other organizations. They want to maybe establish a commercial ecosystem around a particular kind of technology, and they all have a particular view of what that might look like based on their particular business goals. The idea isn't to game out how all those goals work in parallel. The idea is to figure out the common thread, where those goals are in common, and then be able to be smart enough to be, or not naive enough to realize that at some point there is no commonality.
And that's a different context.
Right, but that's not my job. Like, the market is an effective force in allowing for competition.
It's a different context in terms of how companies have operated as
that's exactly correct.
As opposed from like a product-centric focus to more of a shared R&D.
Right, and so the market was the force that allowed for interest to come together or not, and has been an effective. In the proprietary world, you just duked it out forever, right?
Right. It was a zero-sum game.
Exactly, and what happened is now we have this, we've moved beyond that zero-sum game by organizations saying, hey, wait a second, we're all making this, operating system kernel. Why are we doing this to ourselves? Our customers don't care about it. They care about the application APIs, for example. In an automotive implementation, they care about the user interface, the instrument cluster, the navigation system, the entertainment. But they don't care about the middleware and the software underneath. So companies have said, all right, rather than competing on these certain things, we can get to market faster. We can, compete more effectively. We can shed commodity R&D by basically banding together. And so this is where organizations like ours, as a nonprofit, can find that common ground. The market can solve where they differ. That's just not my deal, right?
No.
I'm here to find commonality, and then when we do that effectively, and we align the interests, remember, everyone has to be getting their interests met. We align those interests, where in the auto sector, like, nobody wants to compete on middleware, nobody wants to compete on the kernel. We then align that with developer interest, which is, wow, I'd really love to work on the code that goes into a Lexus or a Jaguar Land Rover vehicle. And, again, if you can take the interest of industry and then align that with developer interest, right, which is to work on these interesting things, the outcomes are tremendous.
That's where the kind of intellectual study really seems to intersect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where, you guys are not focused on the market economics. That's not your focus, right?
No.
But the foundations, serve as a vehicle,
right,
for helping people organize and build software that does have economic value.
That's exactly correct. And it also happens to have a benefit to the way developers want to work.
Right.
Because industry is now bought in. Like, hey, let's separate our business decisions from the technical decisions. Let's let those artists create interesting things and give them lots of leeway, to do that. I'll give you some examples and of companies that I think are fairly enlightened in this area. So IBM, when they first started getting involved in Linux, one of the things that they, in order to get their requirements met, would do is pay their developers to, based on the number of patches a developer would get into the kernel. Mm-hmm. Right? So if your code gets into the kernel, however much code, we'd pay you for doing that, some kind of bonus. And it didn't work that great. They then changed the model to say, listen, forget your code getting into the kernel. If the functionality we need to just meet our requirements for competing in the marketplace are met, doesn't matter who gives the code, who wrote that code, we'll give you the same bonus. And it worked really effectively because it allowed developers to meet a set of requirements, but based on the best code, based on mastering their craft, based on the creative process. And that's where we try to really focus, is on the alignment between what developers' interests are, how the best open source development processes work, right, through allowing the best code and organic innovation to happen, aligning those with the business interests who are perfectly willing to pay people full-time to work on these projects, pay for all of the infrastructure to create these projects, to help in govern these projects so that the intellectual property doesn't fall into one particular for-profit entity or another, but remains a neutral entity for decades to come. That's where we spend all of our time at the Linux Foundation.
So how does this all scale? Because if we're kind of at this point, this very, very early point in the market, where we're seeing considerable interest in open source, but only, I mean, as you said yesterday, we're still only seeing a small group of people actually participating. If you think about the overall larger market, I mean, what is the role of the Linux Foundation in the scaling out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Source? Yeah, I mean, you did a survey where we were really interested in, where you saw that of companies with over 100 employees, only 30% of those companies are actually allowing their developers to work in open source projects. And, the question is why? And the next question is, what is the impact? And so the impact we see at the LF, to answer the second question first, is every time we work with a new project in a new sector of technology. Let's take climate change as an example, or let's use automotive again as a better example. We have a group of business executives who say, I'm completely in. I think this is a better way to do software. All the open source theory proves this. Linux is the existence proof that it works. I'm in, right? Well, they have to go educate all of their developers in their corporations, right? In some cases, they have to then, in the auto sector, educate their tier one suppliers, who are the people who actually create the software. Those tier one suppliers, Ishing, Bosch, they then have to train their tier two suppliers, which are software companies that are, boutique to a particular component of a car, who are part of this elaborate supply chain, how to, do this kind of development. And the process of educating these companies, attorneys, executives, software development managers who may have been in the software industry for 30 years doing proprietary software and have never really done any kind of open source development, you have to train them on how to do it. And it's hundreds and hundreds of companies in an elaborate supply chain. And we see the problem of there's a will but not a way, that the lack of education about how to integrate internal software development with external software development is lacking.
That's the factor there.
And we are spending a lot of time creating methodologies, free training, consulting services to get all of these organizations to understand the specific methods as to how to do this.
This gets to this whole idea of really the inside-outside organization,
right?
Where it's like there's an inside engineering function, but there's also an external engineering function, because you're needing to. Because now, if you're like talking about R&D, for example, and you're turning that inside out,
right?
You're now thinking about R&D as a community function, and but still have to think about your software as an internal development function.
Exactly. And what we are seeing, and this gets to the question of how to scale, and shows the benefit of having done 20 of these or 30 of these projects, where we keep each time learning and getting better at how to more rapidly bring developers to the party, companies to the party, unlocking the potential of developers inside companies, is that organizations themselves first need to be committed that this kind of management of external R&D is important. Now, that actually is a pretty easy sell, meaning that most people are already convinced of that. Again, Linux is an existence proof of that. I think, if you look at the technology landscape, that's fairly self-evident. What they need, it isn't the why, but the way. And when I say the way, the specific details. And this is where, in order to scale, we've got to scale a knowledge base. So we'll start with the attorneys. right? Well, they need to be educated on how open source licenses work, how those licenses interact with each other, how components of software take dependencies on other components, and how the intellectual frameworks, the copyright licenses and all of the obligations that come with them affect any obligation that company may have, right? That's the first thing you need to do, because organizations want to know, right? I want to share what I want to share. I want to keep what I want to keep. I want to understand my obligations. I want to understand if it's commercially reasonable for me to do this, right? Next, you have to go to the engineering manager, right? How do you, for example, track the identity of a developer from inside the company to outside the company? We announced yesterday.
We've been working on this. This is hard.
Exactly. So we the To-Do group, we announced yesterday the To-Do group is coming to the Linux Foundation, and these are open source program office managers from companies like Facebook and Google and Box and others. And they have actually developed tools to allow them to do this, to essentially track developer identity from both the inside the company and then outside the company, and then how that code flows into their internal development process back into the external development process. And that's an important skill to have in order to accelerate time to value for bringing open source code in, integrating it into a product, releasing that product, and then making sure that the changes go back into the project so that you don't have to maintain a separate code base over time, defeating the entire purpose of why you wanted to leverage open source in the first place, right? But those are very specific, detailed playbooks, right? You then need to work with product management, for example, or someone in the CTO office, or maybe it's in the CIO office, to think strategically about which open source projects you want to invest in, right? Take the microservice, which you're very familiar with. Take the microservices landscape, right? I mean, here you have across provisioning and orchestration and monitoring and all of these different open source projects, a real mix of different kinds of open source projects at different stages of their life cycle, coming from different sources. You sort of have Kubernetes coming out of Google. You have Mesos, which is being used by a different set of organizations and entities and came from a different source. And how do you pick which one to invest in? How do you decide which open source project you're going to take a long-term commercial dependency upon? Is it the vibrancy of the community? Is it the quality of the code? Right. Is it, there's a ton of metrics. That's a real skill. Right. That's a detailed set of skills that an organization needs. And, I used to do this slide where, I would talk about, I think the top 10 IT companies spend, $50 billion, some roundabout number like that, on R&D, internal R&D. But for these companies, if half the code in their products and services comes from outside of the company, the question really needs to be asked: how are you managing external R&D?
Right.
And so again, to scale this, we want to take the processes from Google and Facebook and organizations, Intel, HP, IBM, who have open source program office managers, who do all these things, who have educated software managers who know how to allow their developers to participate from both inside and outside the company, who are have very well educated attorneys who specialize in the licensing obligations of open source projects, and then extend that knowledge out to the next 1,000, then 2,000 organizations out there who are convinced to participate in open source, who probably are already using a lot of open source, but just are not doing it effectively, and more importantly, in your survey, I think pointed this out, are not allowing their engineers to participate in open source at all.
That's interesting. I guess my last question really is about, so we see, the demand for open source, right? And what you've said speaks to that. On the other side, we have like the companies who are supplying the technology, right? And what a lot of large companies that are involved in this. How is the Linux Foundation trying to cultivate these very young emerging companies to be part of of this ecosystem, right? Because we have there's very large companies who have a very deep interest in open source and how particular open source projects evolve, right?
Right.
But there's also, like you're saying, like these developers who are very innovative, who are building really, really exciting technologies, and they are starting their own companies.
Sure.
Right? But as we well know, business is tough no matter what business you're in, right?
Yeah.
And open source has its particular challenges, right?
Right.
How is the Linux Foundation trying to, bring these, these very kind of like very fragile, young technology companies into this, into its big tent?
Yeah. I mean, so I have a bias here myself in that most of my career has been spent in Silicon Valley. I was at several startups before I started this job and had some good outcomes. I've had some bad outcomes. And so I'm very, very sympathetic with the challenges of running a small, particular software company in any environment. What's important for us at the Linux Foundation to do is, if you think about what a company who's focused on a particular open source project or on open source itself needs to look at, and Pingley, again, from Excel, I thought said this very well by describing 3 stages: the project, the product, and then the profit component of it. We're really focused on the project component. Now, small companies with a lot of focus and good talent can listen to the market and create really interesting products. I would argue that the focus of a small firm allows them to do that in some cases much more effectively than a large firm, because they're just really, we want to know your big data requirements. That's all we're doing. I'm not trying to sell you servers over here. I'm not trying to give you some kind of service over there. I'm just focused, right? And that's of high value to any kind of company. And then the profit component, I think that small companies are also can be very innovative in their profit models, whether it's a subscription service, because they're not cannibalizing any pre-existing form of revenue by having a disruptive technology out there. So I feel like in the second 2 components of that, the productization and the profitization, essentially making money off it for small companies, they're pretty good at it, right? And you see the outcomes of companies like Cloudera and Hortonworks and Red Hat are examples of that, but there's many, many more, and you know these companies well. Some of them won't succeed, but many of them will. But we want to focus on the project side in making sure that there's a fair, level, balanced playing field where both small and large companies can participate in a meaningful way. And so the question then becomes, how do you do that? Well, first of all, you allow your projects to be open to anyone. That's what makes open source work effectively, right? The irony of many of these projects is you don't need to pay a nickel to participate.
Right.
Although companies want to pay to underwrite the infrastructure to do this stuff, right? Regardless of whether that's a requirement or not. Why? Because they're taking a 20-year commercial dependency in many cases on this code, right? So they have a real self-interest in making sure that there's some stable structure around this. But not everyone needs to do that, and that's totally fine, and that gives an opportunity for smaller firms to participate in these projects. Smaller firms also bring something to the table, which you mentioned at the outset in how you posed the question, which is they often employ the actual key developers themselves, which are the great equalizer because, for example, in our Hyperledger project, which is a distributed ledger system, essentially blockchain technology, to find a developer who is a cryptographic expert, who understands database technology, understands how to create a distributed, cryptographically secure database at scale. These are not people who are growing on trees. These are extremely rarefied, incredibly talented developers. And if you look at the difference between the top 2-3% of developers in terms of their productivity, in terms of the artfulness of what they do versus the rest, it's just an order of magnitude larger impact, right? I mean, you have the CEOs of major tech firms saying, like, listen, my top 1% of my developers are 100 times more productive than the bottom 80%, right? It's that whole 80-20 rule. And that becomes a good balancing force as long as you structure them. And so that's how we think about it, is separate the business decisions from the technology decisions and make sure that these projects are open to anyone to participate, make sure that the decision-making process in the technical component of the project allows for anyone to rise to the top based on their contributions to become a contributor and a committer and then subsequently a maintainer and so on and so forth. And that provides for that balance. So those companies are going to figure out how to productize their stuff. They're going to figure out how to make a profit. We want to just make sure that everyone has a fair shot in the project side of it, because, despite the conspiracy theory that the 600 companies who invest in all of these projects have some elaborate plan to infuse money in order to undermine these projects, it's just quite the opposite. They're just genuinely interested in doing joint development. They don't see the project component as a place where they're competing in the market. In fact, quite to the opposite. And then the market's going to decide how those things get productized and then how profits are driven subsequently based on that.
Well, Jim, this has been an interesting discussion. Thank you for taking the time. There's lots more to explore here. And we look forward to following up and continuing to follow this narrative. So thanks again.
All right, thanks for having me.